Hello everybody and welcome to Niblesnarf's Den of Game Reviews. I am your host Niblesnarf and I will be taking you through a history of games that I played from my past. We will cover games as old as the Atari to the latest generation of games, or whatever game I feel like reviewing at that time. And for our very first Niblesnarf's Den of Gaming Reviews, we are going to do something that is near and dear to my heart. Today's game that I will be reviewing is a game from my past, released back in 1994. I am, of course, speaking about none other than Castlevania Bloodlines for the Sega Genesis 16-bit era. That's right, folks. I'm going to be taking you back way into the past, so I hope you enjoyed that bit of whiplash. With that being said, this is the fifth game in the home console era of Castlevania. Specifically, I'm stating fifth for home console because I know a lot of you would probably consider the Game Boy as a console, which is true, but that was not something that you could not take with you in terms of the Game Boy titles. You had to play this one in front of your TV, switching that channel to good old 3 or 4, and probably slapping your TV a couple times because it wouldn't respond. I know I did. Now, before we get into the actual gameplay itself, let's talk about the history of Bloodlines and how it came into being. Back in the 16-bit era for Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo, we had Castlevania on the Super Nintendo, but we never had a Castlevania on the Sega Genesis. Sega had reached out to Konami in Japan and had requested that a Castlevania be made for their console as well. With that being said, Konami then decided, well, we don't want to follow the bloodline of the Belmonts. We want to do our own spin-off of the series, a Gaiden, if you would. They decided then to actually loosely base it off of Bram Stoker's Dracula, giving us two characters, John Morris, as well as Eric Lecarde. Now that you know a little bit of the brief history of how this game came to be, let's get into the game itself. Now, to start the game off, obviously we have to address what the origin of the story is here. And in Castlevania Bloodlines, you find that the Belmonts are no more. And now that our new vampire hunters, John Morris and Eric Lecarde, have to take up the legendary vampire killer that's been passed down from the Belmont family to the Morris family, and Alucard's spear, which is what Eric Lecarde ends up wielding. And they chase after this woman who is named Elizabeth Bartley, who is actually based off Elizabeth Bathory. Our two heroes must chase her down throughout all of Europe in order to stop her from resurrecting the dreadful Dracula. Starting off in the most obvious location where they should start off, which is the ruins of Dracula's castle in Castlevania in Romania, and only to find that she has escaped through their grasp and gone to Greece. From there, from Greece to Italy, from Italy to Germany, from Germany to France, and from France, the final battle happens in England. But before we can begin our journey, the Niblesnarf players must choose which character we wish to have brought into this. You can choose John Morris, who wields the legendary vampire killer, or you can choose Eric Lecarde, who wields the Alucard spear. There is an actual difference in the playstyle between the two, and this is the first Castlevania that actually allows you to choose which playstyle you want to go with off the bat. So with that being said, I think we're going to go ahead and start with Eric Lecarde. And it's important to note that there are different attacks per character that's in this. In this, for Eric Lecarde, he has a 6-directional attack. He can attack from left to right, he can attack upwards, he can also attack diagonal. This is all while standing on the ground. He gets a down attack too, but of course you have to jump to attack like that. He also gets a super jump that allows him to scale higher floors over John Morris. So already I think he's got a better advantage. He also has quicker speed, and if you hold down the button while you're attacking, you'll also throw the spear around. But that's not to say that John Morris is a slacker. Oh no, that beefy beefcake right there can also do some things that Eric Lecarde could not do. While he only is allowed to attack in 5 directions, and it is a little curious to me why they made the decision to allow him to only do a diagonal attack while jumping. No, John gets the ability to swing from platform to platform. And the vampire killer is slightly stronger over Eric Lecarde's spear. So you trade that speed and that ability to attack in any direction for brute strength and the ability to literally whip yourself across the arena. Just whoosh, there you go. After you've chosen your character, and as you guys recalled, I've already said it, I'm choosing Eric Lecarde, you will be granted with your first in-game cutscene, which in this one is going to be Romania. You'll see on the map that we're in Romania for the ruins of Castle Dracula. Now, for a opening sequence, this is actually a pretty good stage to start with. It's your typical Castlevania side-scrolling screen. It helps you get the feel for the control, whether you are doing your attacks, your items. And in this one, it's important to note that the heart system is no longer available. It is now gems. Gems are what you will use for when you acquire your sub-weapons. And of course, it is important to note that the sub-weapons will play a factor here too. You'll get a chance to experience all of them, including the super sub-weapon, which is what you get when you acquire the 4th level up for your primary weapon. However, in order for that to take effect, you have to remember that you've got to have a sub-weapon equipped. If you find that 4th power-up and you don't have a sub-weapon, you don't get that power-up. Now, what's great about this stage as well is that on top of teaching you the basics and how to use some of your sub-weapons that you will find, as well as the level-up system for your weapons, this stage also has a neat little feature in it too that is important depending on which character you choose. As you guys recall earlier when I said, with John Morris, he has the ability to whip himself across the arena by grabbing the area above him. But with Eric Lecard, he's got a unique feature where he can actually skip certain areas altogether. And this is showcased here in the first stage when you get to where the first power-up is that gives you your ultimate weapon to begin with. If you're Eric Lecard, you can destroy the wall, which will contain future wall chicken, as well as crouch down, charge up, and then jump up to the top to move on to the next stage. Once you've gotten past this area, you'll be greeted with your first boss of the game, which is actually a mini-boss. This is your typical warg. Now, young Snarf, when he fought this thing, he didn't realize that, wargs were these big were-dogs type things. They're not necessarily wolves, but they're not werewolves either. They're kind of like a mutated form. And of course, it is important to note that this game has some fantastic animation when it comes to your bosses and it comes to your minions that you have to fight. As you've seen, like all previous Castlevanias, where you have to fight your skeletons, your bats, your Medusa heads. This one, on top of that too, adds those same characters in, but gives them a little extra detail when you eliminate them. They get a special finish, is the best way to put it, a little bit of gore to go with it. Which is, for a Sega Genesis title, this was a unique concept. You would never have seen this on a Super Nintendo. After you defeated the warg, you'll be greeted with a couple more sub-levels to the stage itself. And again, this is Castlevania. This is based off the original Nintendo style Castlevania, so it's not just beat the boss and move on. You actually have additional sections you have to go through. As you'll see up in the top right corner, it says stage 1 through 5. It actually goes up to stage 1 through 9. Sometimes in other stages it can end as early as 7 and others go up high as 11. And this was pretty common for a lot of the Castlevanias before we moved on to what would soon be called the Metroidvanias of Castlevania. The first boss for Castle Dracula Romania is actually a boss that is kind of a staple for the series, which is the battle armor. Although in this game it was a little odd to me as a young Snarf to have it be called the crazy armor. I guess that would only make sense considering that one hand's got an axe, the other hand's got a lance, and it jumps around and it's kind of unpredictable. But once you get the pattern figured out for it, it was pretty much a cakewalk. You beat the boss, you get the orb, and you move on to the next stage. And welcome to stage 2, where we are at the Atlantis Shrine in Greece. A young Snarf actually was a big fan of Greek mythology and was tickled pink when he saw Minotaurs and the Talos in this area, as well as various other Greek mythology monsters. And here was also one of the coolest things that I remember as a child playing this game, was that on top of the stage itself having a very unique background, you would also notice that you had the really cool unique water effects that are in this stage too. And that does come into play later as you're playing, as this water stage it's a water stage. What does water do? It rises. And in this stage, it's rising to kill you. And your mid-boss for this stage is actually going to be a wizard, who is the reason why this water is rising. Pretty straightforward fight, nothing crazy, take him out, move on. It's as simple as that. Eric Lecard actually gets a nice benefit from this stage as well, as he can just quickly jump up the platforms instead of having to go up the traditional way, where John Morris unfortunately has to use the legs to do some walking. Moving on to the next part of this stage though, we have a little bit more to deal with, and then we get to the final boss, which we are greeted with Talos, the giant walking armor. After you've brought down the mighty Talos, you move on to the next stage, which is the Leaning Tower of Pisa in Italy. Now, I have to actually bring forth some cool mentions to this stage itself. This is also where choosing your character makes an impact as to which route you go with. For Eric Lecard, in a certain point of the stage, he's actually able to take a higher up route, which allows him to move through without any problems. If you play as John Morris, though, he has to take a different route, and the difference actually comes down to Eric Lecard's super jump as well as Morris's ability to whip himself across the arena. Although in this stage, Morris doesn't have to worry about falling to the death, it does come into play later. Talking about this stage, though, too, also brings us to our first mini-boss, which was kind of a repeat of what we've already seen, the Skeledragon. This is a giant snake-like boss based off the actual white dragon heads that you've already seen throughout not just this stage, but the previous stages. Pretty easy, straightforward, nothing crazy, take him down, move on. After the defeat of the not-so-mighty Skeledragon, you now get to do the climb of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and this is where the game takes some liberties, which I truly like. Where the climb itself is pretty straightforward, the tower is swaying to and fro, trying to imitate like it's being blown in the wind, which is a pretty cool concept. It also brings back our classic nemesis, the Medusa heads, which one hit from them will pretty much ruin your day. Once you get past that, though, it's just another really unique stair climb as the platforms come around and you find yourself outside the Leaning Tower of Pisa, going to the top. You get to the top, you're greeted with the final boss of the stage, known as the Gargoyle. This is another one of those fights where it's very much straightforward, you just have to pay attention to the pattern. What's cool about this fight, though, is that you're actually watching the fight from the perspective of the boss as the tower spins around, spinning in the direction that the gargoyle is attacking you from. After you put the mighty fearsome gargoyle to rest, you move on to the next stage, which is going to be the Munitions factory in Germany. Now, this stage is kind of a staple classic for Castlevania, and it's not so much because it's the Munition factions for Germany, it's because this stage also has your infamous clock tower-like areas. Move on, get to the mini-boss, and it's Frankenstein. Frankenstein was actually pretty cool in this stage itself, being that it actually was a representation of what Frankenstein was, which was a very tall monster. Granted, I don't remember Frankenstein shooting lightning out of its hands and shockwaves, but, you know, that's neither here or there. This is a video game at the end of the day. Take down Frankenstein, you're moving on, and you get to deal with the mighty Clockworks as well as the infamous Cogs that could kill you, and the Medusa heads once again make a return. One bad hit from them and it's all over for you. You get to the end of this, and then you have to deal with a boss, which I'm not so sure how I felt about this boss. I didn't really care for it, but it was a cool feature used for the Sega Genesis graphics to try to have this 3D-esque boss be there, the Gear Steamer as it's called. Just this giant amalgamations of gears with an orb that just controls it. Not a very tough boss, get rid of it, moving on. After the destruction of Gear Steamer, we move on to the next stage in our journey. The Palace of Versailles, France. Here, we will have to be introduced to a new monster which I just absolutely hate with a passion. It's known as the Skeleton Monkey, and while the first section of the stage itself kind of throws a little curveball at you where the flowers are raining down more or less confusion poison, it doesn't do anything other than just reverse your controls. Nothing crazy, just remember that left is right, right is left, and that is simple as that. You get to the Skeleton Monkey, though, and this thing is just the most pain in the butt to deal with. I hate it with a snarfing passion. But once you get past that, and thankfully this is the only time you ever come across it, once you get past it, though, you're granted with a plethora of knights. Different types of knights. You have axe knights, sword knights, two-story tall knights. You get to the next section, and the next section itself actually will be a alternate route that you get to take as Eric Lecard, which I strongly recommend taking, because if you go the other way, which would be John Morris's way, you won't be clearing that passage because Eric Lecard cannot swing across the ceiling. So you take the up route, you go up, you go to the right, and you move on with your life. And if you're John Morris, you actually cannot go up, so you have to go to the right, and you have to get good at swinging across this passage. Because John Morris cannot do the super jump, John Morris has to prove why he's better than Indiana Jones. Once you get past this area as Eric Lecard or John Morris, you're greeted once more by bow and arrow knights, hammer shakers, a wheeled knight, and a knight with a Gatling gun. That's right, folks, a Gatling gun. Take them all down, and you'll be greeted once more with another mini-boss. This time, instead of one, you get to deal with two. And this mini-boss is kind of a tricky one, known as the Silhouette Demon. Take it out, as it is the pillar, not the faces. And once you get to the end of the stage, you get to fight none other than Marie Antoinette. That's right, she's here to give you your cake and tell you that you can eat it too. Except for, look out, it's not Marie Antoinette. No, actually, it is the Princess of Moths. That's right. Marie Antoinette was just a disguise for the true boss. And this boss itself is a typical just straight up beat it down, move on with your life type thing. There's nothing crazy about this boss. It was a cool little feature. Surprise, hello, moving on with our lives. Moving on to Stage 6, the final stage. Castle Proserpina in England. That's right, our final battle with Elizabeth Bartley will happen here in England itself. This stage itself is actually going to be kind of a unique one, because this stage throws a bunch of unique features at you that you have not dealt with at this point in time, which is, to me, both neat as well as frustrating when you get right down to it, because you haven't seen any mechanic like this beforehand. At one point in the stage, you get to where the area goes from being your standard area to being split in 3 sections. It looks like it's a mirrored version of itself. And the part that makes this stage difficult is that you don't know exactly where you need to look, but what people tend to forget, the best way to beat this is to just look at your feet. Don't look at your body, don't look at your head. They're not where they think they are. After you beat that, you move on to the next stage, which is, oh no, an upside down stage. Kind of a cop-out in my opinion. I mean, just considering that you already dealt with this really unique stage that had this 3 different sections, but that's, it's whatever. It's not a big deal. We just move on from there, take care of it, moving on with our lives. Simple as that. Here, we will come across not 1 mini-boss, not 2 mini-bosses, but 3 mini-bosses as you fight Death. That's right, folks, Death once more comes back, and he has cards to play with you. Now, this Death is actually different than most Deaths you've already fought up to this point. If you've ever played any other Castlevania, it's always just been a battle with Death, not a card battle with Death. And Death is unique in this situation where you have to attack the card. Death will now send his cards out, and they will spin around him. Swing your mighty weapon, hit a card, and you can be greeted with health. You can be greeted with an attack from Death, or you can be greeted with a boss from a previous stage. Now, if you end up hitting one of the cards for the boss of each stage, you end up fighting a slightly weaker version of that boss, but you will be sent to the stage where you fought them originally. You have a chance of fighting the Gargoyle, the Gear Steamer, or the Golem. Once more, weaker versions, the fights are the same, take them down, move on. After you've eliminated all of Death's cards, Death himself will come into play. Death is a very straightforward boss, nothing crazy about him. He'll sweep at you with the scythe, he'll throw some magic at you, follow the pattern, take him down, move on. You'll quickly notice after you take down Death that you're being moved forward to the next area of this final stage. And the next area itself is just getting you your items, of course, typical Castlevania fashion where you're getting ready to fight the final boss. And in this situation, it is Elizabeth Bartley. But oh no, it's not Elizabeth Bartley. Instead, it's actually Medusa. This Medusa is standard Medusa, although for the fact that I don't recall Medusa ever throwing fireballs at you. But I do recall Medusa trying to whip you with her tail, as well as claw your face off. Take her down, move on, and it's to Elizabeth Bartley herself. Now, Elizabeth Bartley is actually a pretty cool concept of a fight. She'll summon these orbs in the background, and these orbs are actually the big spell that she's going to unleash upon you. You have to hit her for the amount of orbs that you see. So if you see 4 orbs, you got to hit her 4 times. You see 5, hit her 5. Take her down, and move on, and thus you beat the game. But oh wait, did you? This is a Castlevania after all. And what is a Castlevania without a Dracula? After you proceed up the staircase and replenish your items, hopefully you've got some health, hopefully you still have your mega weapon, and if not, that's okay, it's still Dracula, and Dracula still goes down if you know how to hit him. That's right folks, the big bad man himself, Dracula, has been resurrected. Elizabeth Bartley succeeded, and you are greeted with the most infamous song of them all. Simon Belmont's theme. And of course, Sega Genesis has always had a really good way of using its chipset. While not as superior as the Super Nintendo's chipset for its music, I still feel it hits this one right on the money. This Dracula is actually a repeat of the Dracula from Castlevania 1, which was the standard hit and run tactics. Take him down and you're greeted with another form of Dracula. I gotta say, this Dracula was actually kind of a cool one, because when you fought this Dracula himself, instead of it just being the man, the myth, the vampire, he ends up turning into kind of a demon, and as the fight proceeds, he slowly gets bigger each time you hit him, and then once you finally get to a point where you hit him so many times, he actually starts shedding off parts of his body. This, I thought, was really cool, because it kind of emphasized like how serious of the battle it was. Rip that body apart, and then you are greeted victoriously with a screen at the end of it all that is the credits. And you can put your controller down and take a breath and enjoy the myriad of the bosses that you have already fought. That's right, guys. You have been greeted with the ending. You have gone through hell and you have fought Dracula. And your cutscenes show you everything you had. This was kind of necessary, though, to be honest with you, because, like, again, when we talk about this sort of stuff, like Castlevania itself, this was before Symphony of the Night. This was before the Metroidvania-style Castlevanias, where they were more story-driven. This was your standard arcade-style games, where, you have to have your cast, your credit scenes, and then, of course, your guys that you fought, which I know I called them earlier Frankenstein's monster. It's also known as the creature, and the credits will show you that too. But that's not a big deal. You've won. Who cares? You beat it. And with that, we are moving on to the good, the bad, and the snarf. Let's start with the good. The game. How does it handle? How does it feel? To me, I felt this game handled quite well. In terms of actual control and responsibility, when you hit your buttons, it feels good. When you land your attack, it feels good. The audio cues are on spot, and the visuals are very, very good to the eye. No complaints. The music itself is also awesome. As always, Castlevania just delivers. If there's one thing that I've always enjoyed about a Castlevania game, is that the music itself is top notch. And in Bloodlines, even though the songs themselves are kind of repeats of other songs, you did get introduced with a couple new songs as well. In Stage 4, it has probably one of the best songs the game has to offer. The bad. That's right. As there's always good, there must be bad. As there's always light, there must be dark. As there's always Dracula, there must be a Belmont. First on the chopping block, the continue system and the life system. As it is a 16-bit generation game, and I get the need to have a continue system and a life system, I've always wondered what is the point between the two. Why give yourselves lives and then give yourselves continues? In my opinion, in a situation like this where Castlevania was a major trial and error, which is also a bane of a continue system, it does raise the replayability value of this game. And back then, for the 16-bit era, this was quite common. In today's day and age, it has not aged well. And while I understand the difficulty of it needing to be there, it's still not a good system. It wasn't good then, it's not good now. Next is the password system. I personally feel that a password system in a 16-bit game, of all things, was kind of unnecessary. And the reason I say this is that we are in a 16-bit era. Save files were a thing that started to exist way more commonly in most of your games at this point in time. Now granted, Castlevania, of course, never really relied upon this until you got to Rondo of Blood and Symphony of the Night. It still had this. And a password system itself, while I'll give it a pass on Super Nintendo's Castlevania 4, Super Castlevania, because that was a first-gen title, this was not a first-gen title. This was actually about halfway through the Sega Genesis lifespan. There should have been a save system, so that way you could stop and do what you needed to do and then come back to it later. This was not an easy game by any means. Which also comes to the difficulty of the game that I want to talk about. The difficulty of this game, while I love this game, if you were somebody to pick it up and play it in this day and age, you would find this game rather frustrating. You would find it rather difficult. And of course back then, that was the point. To have the game to be difficult was to mean that it was meant to come back and you would keep trying and trying and trying. You weren't granted 40 hours of gameplay and 40 hours of story. No, you actually had, like, from start to finish, I could beat this game within 2 hours. Most people could beat this game within 2 hours once they know what they're doing. But the difficulty of it has always been very, very frustrating. And now let's talk about the snarf, my personal opinions and my personal view of this game itself. While I've already sprinkled some of the views and my opinions of this game into this, I am going to give it to you from the top to the bottom, from the inside to the outside, the snarf as I call it. Castlevania Bloodlines is still a title that holds up insanely well in this day and age. It is a fun game, albeit a frustrating game. If you're a person who loves a good challenge, there is no better game to play than this game. From the stages themselves, the wide variety that you got to deal with, from Romania to Germany to Greece to France to England, I will say that my favorite things about this were how each stage had neat little interactions to it. In stage 2, you got to see the stage 2 appear on the top, but if you paid close attention to the water effects, it also appeared down there. In stage 1, if you pause the game right before you battle the ward, the lightning in the background flashes even though the game is paused. The world kept going even though these things were happening that were keeping your character from moving. There is a word for this. This is called diegetic. And what that means is that the world has things such as, like, the title go through and it interacts with the world. In this situation, you wouldn't think that the character in the world can see the title, but the world sees the title and the character doesn't. It does bring up that interesting question. Does the character see the title or not? And this is one of those things where, again, this is a personal viewing of this. I actually thought this was really cool. I thought this was unique. But the thing that really sold me the most about this Castlevania game was that it was a 16-bit Castlevania game on the Sega Genesis. Even though it wasn't the Belmonts, it did a great job representing what the Belmonts had brought us. A fun title. Hard. Balls-ass hard. But definitely fun. And if you were looking to try to play this game in this day and age, you could pick it up off the Castlevania collection that's on Steam, that's on any of the current generation platforms, or if you were a die-hard person to find it, at the time of this recording, you could find this title. It's still $50 out there. I mean, if you're a die-hard physical collector, get this in your collection. I promise you, you won't regret it. Fantastic title from the Snarf himself as a recommendation. And with that recommendation, we must say adieu, as we have spent our time together. I hope you enjoyed this review. If you liked what you saw today, subscribe, hit that like button below, ring the bell if you want to as well, that's totally fine. If you have some feedback you'd like to give as well, I am always open for feedback, because this is my first time doing this, and is a new journey for me. If you want to hear more from me, or see some of my gameplay in action, check out more content over at the Gaming Theater Presents channel. This is Niblesnarf bidding you adieu. The den is closed. Until next time.